We're happy that you could be with us today. Welcome to everyone. This event is organized by the Baha'i community of the Netherlands and The Hague, and Religions for Peace in the Netherlands. My name is May Taherzadeh, and I'm honored to be moderating this commemoration. I'm speaking to you from Utrecht in the Netherlands. Just over 100 years ago, Abdu'l-Bahá wrote what has come to be known as the Tablet to The Hague, or Tablet of Peace, which is an exploration of the profound societal changes required for the attainment of international peace. Abdu'l-Bahá was the eldest son of Baha'u'llah, who is the founder of the Baha'i faith and his successor. Abdu'l-Bahá was renowned as a champion of social justice, was loved by all who knew him. He was always caring for the sick and the poor, and was a true ambassador for international peace. He explained that peace would require a transformation in human consciousness and a commitment to fundamental spiritual principles proclaimed by Baha'u'llah, such as the abolition of all forms of prejudice, the harmony of science and religion, and the equality of women and men. A universal peace which is based on the recognition of humanity's oneness. Now, over 100 years have passed since Abdu'l-Bahá wrote this tablet. So where do we find ourselves today as a humanity? What has changed? What are the next steps that we need to take in order to attain a more durable peace and justice? Together with our panelists, we will have the opportunity to reflect upon these questions and learn how this tablet can continue to inspire our thoughts and actions, particularly at this unprecedented moment in history when such questions are essential to our collective development. The program today will consist of music, an introductory address, some background information about the Tablet to The Hague, and hearing from our four panelists. There will also be time at the end for any questions or comments you may have. So please use the chat function if you're on Zoom, or the comment section if you are on Facebook for this purpose. To begin, we'll have some music from Luke Slot. Luke is a musician from Ireland, and he has toured to over 20 countries, offering musical presentations that invite people to reflect on the idea of social and spiritual transformation. He is joining us today from San Francisco, California. Welcome, Luke. I believe it's around 5 o'clock in the morning for you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, May. It's really wonderful to be here. I'm very honored to participate in this historic event. And I'd like to begin with some words written by Baha'u'llah called The Sign of Love. O Son of Man, for everything there is a sign. The sign of love is fortitude. my trials, under my decree, under my trials. O Son of Man, for everything there is a sign, the sign of love is fortitude. The sign of love is patience. Under my decree and under my trials, under my decree and under my trials.
Thank you, Luc, for touching our hearts with your beautiful music. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Kathleen Ferrier to give an introductory address. She is the chairperson for the Netherlands Commission for UNESCO, as well as for the Martin Luther King Lecture Foundation. She currently teaches human rights at the Asian University of Women in Bangladesh, and she is the daughter of the first president of Suriname, Johan Ferrier. Dr. Kathleen Ferrier is joining us from near Utrecht, the Netherlands. Welcome. Thank you, we see you. I think are you still on mute? I don't hear you.
No, I'm unmuted now.
Great.
Thank you so much, May. And thank you all for the invitation. I'm so honored to have the opportunity to say a few words at the beginning of this meeting, which I personally consider of huge importance. I want to congratulate the Baha'i community in the Netherlands and Religions for Peace in the Netherlands for their initiative and collaboration, their wisdom and their vision to set up this conference. I speak to you today on behalf of myself only and on my personal experiences, and based on that, I feel that the commemoration of the receiving of the tablet in The Hague, today the city of justice and peace, the commemoration of this 100 years could not take place at a better moment in time. Because our world is in turmoil, and it was in turmoil already for decades, as we could see how power relations on all levels are shifting between continents, within continents, between countries, within countries, between communities, within communities, between ethnic groups, within ethnic groups, even within the smallest organizational entities in our societies. Shift of power relations means loss of power, and loss of power comes with fear and with loss of ethics and morality. And now, with COVID-19, we all can clearly see the weaknesses in the way we as human beings relate to each other. The huge inequalities, financially and socially, are undeniably clear to see. And today, 100 years after the tablet, we know that it is not only politics and governments that can bring the necessary changes and solutions, but that it is us, we the people, who have to speak up and stand for our human rights. That is not easy. The strength to do so often comes from the convictions and inspirations deep in ourselves, the source of our human dignity, and the flame, that inspiration that we call faith or religion, that is what inspires us. That is what gives us strength. Therefore, I am convinced that within religions lies a strong force to inspire people, not to divide, but to unite. We can no longer deny that to solve the many challenges we are facing, we need each other. COVID-19 makes it so clear. Therefore, what the tablet calls for, to step over differences and to unite the forces, the flames, the inspirations inside all of us, is so urgent today. Finally, what I find so important of this meeting is that it calls for concrete action, because that is what we need. Concrete action for the world to see that collaboration is possible, that world peace is possible, and that religions can lead the way forward as they relate to the flames, the inspirations and aspirations that are deep in the hearts of each and all of us. I wish you a fruitful conference and look forward to the many concrete outcomes. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ferrier, for your inspiring message. We are so grateful you could join us and address us today. Thank you.
The honor is mine. Thank you.
Before moving on to the panelists, I'd like to share a little bit about the time in which the tablet to The Hague was written and delivered to help us to contextualize it. In the early 1900s, many gatherings focusing on peace building were being held in the Netherlands. This photograph shows the American delegates to the International Congress of Women, which was held at The Hague in 1915. Here we see the participants of the World Congress for Peace, which was held in 1913 also in The Hague. Interestingly, this photo is taken outside the Peace Palace, and that is the historic international building where our commemoration today was originally planned to be held. But due to the coronavirus pandemic, we have now moved online until conditions change. In April of 1915, an international organization was created in The Hague called Central Organization for a Durable Peace. Now, it's interesting because its primary aim was not to end the current war, which was World War I, but actually to prevent future wars from happening. In 1916, this organization wrote to Abdu'l-Bahá, who was residing in Haifa. But because of the war, communications were blocked. It took 3 years for the organization's letter to reach Abdu'l-Bahá. Upon receiving the letter from the Central Organization for a Durable Peace in 1919, Abdu'l-Bahá responded immediately, entrusting a delegation to deliver his message in person. The tablet to The Hague was delivered to the organization on or around 28 May 1920, which is exactly 100 years ago to this day. The tablet opens with, "O ye esteemed ones who are pioneers among the well-wishers of the world of humanity." It continues to say, "Your intention deserves 1,000 praises because you are serving the world of humanity, and this is conducive to the happiness and welfare of all." It is now my pleasure to introduce you to our panelists. They will each be sharing their thoughts and reflections for about 10 minutes on various key principles which are found in the tablet to The Hague. As illustrated in the tablet, world peace is a collective endeavor. We have asked each panelist to comment on this and also to reflect upon questions such as, what has humanity learned? And what do we still need to learn and do to reach a sustainable peace? There will be time after their remarks for your questions, so please use the chat function or comment section for this purpose. Our first panelist is Ms. Bani Dougal. She is the principal representative of the Baha'i International Community at the United Nations office in New York, currently also serving on the steering committee of the NGO Working Group on the United Nations Security Council. Now, inspired from the tablet to The Hague, Ms. Dougal will be focusing on the abolition of prejudices and the principle of equality between women and men. She is joining us today from New Delhi in India. Welcome, Ms. Dougal.
Thank you, May. In his tablet addressed to the Central Organization for a Durable Peace in The Hague, Abdu'l-Bahá spoke on the imperative of establishing universal peace. In laying out such a vision, he asserted that until the minds of men become united, no important matter can be accomplished. These words, expressed 100 years ago, speak to the heart of the challenges we face today with an unprecedented global pandemic that is deepening inequalities and giving rise to tensions between and within nations. With resurgent forces of racism, nationalism, inequality, and factionalism, and dominant currents in societies everywhere that are pushing people apart, Abdu'l-Bahá's words provide a clear vision for a desperately disoriented world. And with such pertinent principles masterfully articulated, we must ask ourselves then, how do we translate these ideals into practice? In his tablet, Abdu'l-Bahá asserted that the teachings of Baha'u'llah were not limited to the establishment of universal peace. They embraced many teachings which supplemented and supported that of universal peace. I have been asked to touch upon two among these teachings that are outlined in the tablet, namely that religious, racial, political, economic, and patriotic prejudices destroy the edifice of humanity. And the second one is on the equality of women and men. As to the former, Abdu'l-Bahá described that prejudice has been the cause of war over a period of 6,000 years. More recently, the Universal House of Justice, the governing body of the international Baha'i community, in its message dated 18th January 2019, commented on the dangers of prejudice so prevalent today. I quote, "Humanity is gripped by a crisis of identity as various peoples and groups struggle to define themselves, their place in the world, and how they should act. Without a vision of shared identity and common purpose, they fall into competing ideologies and power struggles. Seemingly countless permutations of us and them define group identities ever more narrowly and in contrast to one another. Over time, this splintering into divergent interest groups has weakened the cohesion of society itself. Rival conceptions about the primacy of a particular people are peddled to the exclusion of the truth that humanity is on a common journey in which all are protagonists." Unquote. In the tablet we commemorate today, Abdu'l-Bahá described various forms of prejudice, insidious in nature as well as their inherent falseness. As to religious prejudice, Abdu'l-Bahá cautioned that the true purpose of religion should be the cause of fellowship. We need to ask ourselves, how can we ensure that our efforts as religious communities are realizing this purpose? Are we finding creative ways to foster solidarity during these troubling times? What does a process look like when noble and spiritual ideals derived from our teachings are consulted upon and put into practice, allowing an ever-widening reach of people to come together to think about the betterment of our societies? Organizations like Religions for Peace and others are grappling with these issues and bringing religions together to explore some of the solutions to the problems of the world today. Abdu'l-Bahá also spoke about nationalistic and patriotic prejudices and explained that mankind is one nation and that we all live on a shared homeland. Abdu'l-Bahá advocated that all the world is man's birthplace, and these boundaries and outlets have been devised by man for the promotion of their own interests. The Universal House of Justice expanded on both nationalism and patriotism in its message dated October 1985, The Promise of World Peace. Unbridled nationalism, as distinguished from a sane and legitimate patriotism, must give way to a wider loyalty to the love of humanity as a whole. Baha'u'llah's statement is, "The earth is but one country and mankind its citizens." Then why do prejudices based on national identity reign ascendant during this pandemic, during the past many years? And this touches every member of the human family. At the global level, how can we ensure that our governments collectively devise coordinated approaches in responding to global challenges? And within our nations, how can we expand our loyalties to the well-being of the whole? At the UN, where I work, we are witnessing a rising nativism and breakdown of multilateral collaboration. How can we restore unity to the United Nations and accord for the well-being of all humanity? Both nationalistic and patriotic prejudices are described by Abdu'l-Bahá as the result of human ignorance and selfish motives. We must therefore encourage the promotion of educational programs that address this ignorance by instilling a deep concern for the well-being of all humanity. Abdu'l-Bahá also questioned the existence of prejudice in the economic realm. The inordinate disparity between rich and poor, a source of acute suffering, keeps the world in a state of instability and virtually on the brink of war. COVID-19 is further entrenching these extremes both within and between nations. How can we draw on the spiritual truth that well-being of each part is inextricably connected to the well-being of the whole? The solution calls for the combined application of spiritual, moral, and practical approaches, and we need to work collectively to determine what these are if we are to address these persistent inequalities. And finally, Abdu'l-Bahá commented on political prejudice, asserting that the policy of God is greater than human policy, as God treats all individuals alike. No distinction is made. Yet today we can see nations and factions pointing fingers at each other, exacerbating divisions in the name of advancing political agendas. We must ask ourselves, how can spiritual principles such as solidarity and unity come to be embodied in political institutions and processes? How can we find points of consensus to build upon our efforts and learn from each other, since none of us have the answers? In the tablet we commemorate today, Abdu'l-Bahá described that the world of humanity cannot be saved from the darkness of nature and cannot attain illumination except through the abandonment of prejudices and acquisition of the morals of the kingdom of God. The abandonment of prejudices is only possible through the recognition of our oneness, our shared identity. Acceptance of the oneness of mankind is thus a prerequisite for reorganization and administration of the world as one country, the home of humankind. As to the second teaching of Baha'u'llah, which I touch on today, namely the equality of women and men, is based on the recognition that woman and man are equal in the sight of God, and that the soul has no gender. Abdu'l-Bahá used the beautiful and evocative imagery of a bird. He asserted that the world of humanity has two wings. One is woman and the other man, and not until both wings are equally developed can the bird fly. Should one wing remain weak, flight is impossible. Not until the world of women becomes equal to the world of men in the acquisition of virtues and perfections can success and prosperity be attained as they ought to be. While we can see considerable progress in the area of gender equality, its expression in all facets of life is far from realized. Humanity as a whole has suffered tremendously by being deprived of the participation of women in every era of civilization. By working together as partners and co-workers, women and men can learn how to draw on constructive expressions of power to build a fair and equal society. Yet concerted action must be taken at all levels of society to create conditions for this meaningful participation and for the breaking down of patriarchal modes of thinking and operating. We see a lot of progress in the area of gender equality since the time Abdu'l-Bahá addressed the Hague with this tablet. However, there are still deeply entrenched attitudes in both women and men that are preventing this equality from being realized. Baha'i communities the world over, together with their collaborators, are working to overcome these forms of prejudice. While valuing diversity, They have been learning how to translate an appreciation for the oneness of humanity into all aspects of life. They've been working to build up and broaden a system of social organization based on these teachings. Recognizing that prejudice stems from ignorance, these communities have been implementing educational programs that instill attitudes of amity and concord to collectively work towards the betterment of society. Their programs of education, transformative in their effect and encompassing both the material and spiritual aspects of life, welcome everyone who wishes to contribute to the community's prosperity. They seek to cultivate environments in which children can be raised untainted by any form of racial, national, or religious prejudice, championing the full equality of women with men in the affairs of the community. They seek to foster love for all people thereby, subordinating lesser loyalties to the best interests of humankind. Universal peace is the destination towards which humanity has been moving throughout the ages, and it can only be achieved through the unreserved acceptance of humanity's oneness, our shared identity and common purpose. As long as prejudices and inequalities described by Abdu'l-Bahá 100 years ago and still so prevalent today persist, there will be cause for bloodshed. The reality that humanity is one people must therefore be the starting point in devising constructive approaches towards enduring peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Dougal, for your inspiring and very relevant contribution. Thank you for joining us. Our second panelist is Professor Azza Karam. She is the Secretary General of Religions for Peace International and Professor of Religion and Development at the Free University in Amsterdam. She serves as the lead facilitator for the United Nations Strategic Learning Exchanges on Religion, Development, and Diplomacy. Professor Karam will be focusing on the principle of the harmony between religions. She is joining us today from New York. Welcome, Professor Karam.
Thank you very much for this incredible honor of being able to join such a distinguished group of panelists and on this wonderful occasion that commemorates a very important moment in history for all humanity and a very important document, I believe, for the survival and welfare of all humanity. And thank you for hosting me so graciously. I'm incredibly thrilled to be able to think aloud with you. I have not prepared a statement. I just want to share a few things from the heart, if you will allow me. The harmony between religions isn't a luxury, as some people seem to assume. Some, especially secular politicians, assume that religion is something that is a private matter and can be brought into the public space as long as it has very clear parameters. We engage with religious leaders on specific issues, usually to rubber stamp secular approaches. We have our bodies of religious actors often given very clear mandates in the public sphere so that things don't get out of hand and out of control. And I think all of this misses a very, very critical point, which Professor Kathleen and Bani, Ms. Bani Dougal have also addressed, which is that at the end of the day, our faith, as deeply personal as it is, also is very instructive for the way we think, feel, and behave at all moments. We don't walk out of our house and leave the faith behind. We don't go into an office to do faith and then walk out of the office and forget about the faith. Our faith is our second skin. It is very much who we are as human beings. The minute we lose touch with what we believe in, that is also the minute that we lose touch with why we are alive and how we can relate to one another. We relate to one another through the prism of that which we believe. And that's why faith is an incredibly integral component. It's in our eye, ear, all the senses contain and are guided by what we believe in, our faith, which is why I found it extremely interesting reflecting on what there is in
what has been mentioned in the tablet and looking at our COVID response globally, both from the perspective of what's happening inside families to communities to the global infrastructure. And one thing struck me, and it perhaps is not a very positive thing, but bear with me for a minute. I assumed, as naive as I am, that COVID would bring us together regardless of all barriers, which is the fundamental principle of Religions for Peace, that we must come together as people of faith, because our faith is us. We are faith, and there is no way to live our lives without that faith. But COVID has done two things. It's brought out the very best in all humanity. It's also, quite frankly, and let's face it, brought out the not so good stuff. The things that we would have much rather not seen and certainly not have to live through. It's brought out our tribal primitive fears of trying to come together, yes, but come together with our like-minded, our own kind of people, our own kind of way of thinking, the us and them. It's exacerbated a lot of the us and them. Yes, it's created a very nice us because people help each other, but do people really help each other beyond the traditional parameters and boundaries and borders that we use? I think COVID has helped us close borders amongst ourselves in more ways than one. In the same way that it has helped us come together, it has also helped us close borders. Our fears are very operational in moments of crises. Our fears become the first thing that guides us in moments of crises. And what Abdu'l-Bahá was trying to always systematically tell us, from what I understand, is that fear has no place when you have faith. That faith is to help overcome fear. It eliminates fear. It is the light that eliminates the darkness. What we are not seeing happen systematically is precisely that this faith can help us eliminate the darkness. Far from coming together, even religious communities, religious organizations who are now on the front lines serving all communities remarkably, because governments cannot do it all. But even with religious institutions and organizations, there is a bit of a lag when it comes to working across the religious institutional differences and the religious differences. And this was something that I think is deeply instructive. Why? Because it shows us that we have quite some ways to go to actually believe that we are one. So the advocacy, the admonition, the caution is we must see ourselves as one humanity. But when fear strikes at the heart of us, we don't necessarily behave as one humanity. We search to seek where we will find our small groups. So that's why Religions for Peace brings up something else. Any entity that believes in religions working together for peace brings up a very important point. It's extraordinarily timely that, ironically, it's not enough to believe. It is deeply important to act on our beliefs, which is also something that Baha'u'llah and the entire Baha'i faith affirms as almost all, if not every single faith tradition also affirms. We must act our beliefs. We must act upon our beliefs. It is very fine to believe good things, but frankly, religions everywhere call upon us to enact our belief. And if the belief indicates, as all beliefs do, that we must be one, we must work as one, then that becomes how we live our faith. And I think we lose touch a little bit with the notion that yes, our principles are all there, but how we act on our principles is what we're talking about. Well, nobody's disputing that we must all be one. But I think the question becomes, how do we come together as one in spite of all the different kinds of differences? And there's only one answer that I can see. It's not a crisis. A crisis is not sufficient, clearly. The lesson learned from COVID is a crisis is necessary but not sufficient to bring us all together. It helps us see where we're not coming together, yes. It helps some of us come together, yes. But it is not going to make us all come together. So therefore, there must be something else. There must be another button we press, another thing to fine-tuning that we need to do as human beings. as humanity to then come together. Because if the crisis like this that's affecting everybody is still not making that magic happen, then where is that magic? That magic, I believe very firmly, is within. It is the commitment, the deliberate commitment to come together as faithful people. Doesn't matter what the faith says. As faithful people, we must actively, deliberately, intentionally seek to come together. Our beliefs are fine, are wonderful, but belief minus action means that we will constantly be talking about principles we will not implement. The deliberate nature of coming together, the intentionality of coming together across differences is precisely what Baha'u'llah was calling for, is precisely what Religions for Peace stands for, and what it is determined to do. Why would we need an organization of all religions anywhere in the world unless we're still not able to be deliberate about coming together? What these kinds of organizations, interfaith and multi-religious organizations, do is they enforce that determination to come together in spite of, precisely because of our differences. Which is why I am incredibly grateful and honored to the Baha'i community, to Religions for Peace Netherlands, for enacting the principles of every single faith tradition, for informing, for insisting on that principle of coming together. Many people push back and say, well, what, we're just going to come together to have a party and have a dialogue and talk about how wonderful our respective religions are and what is common to all of us. Well, gee, life is full of more. Yes, life is full of more. Life is full of what we're all facing right now, which is a major human catastrophe. But this catastrophe is related to something else. It's related to our environment. We have actively, systematically abused our environment so much without seeming to appreciate that in order to be people of faith, in order to come together, we must, first and foremost, protect that environment. The land we walk on, the air we breathe, this has to be protected. How can we talk about our religions and our faiths when we are not considering how it is that the very land we walk on the air we breathe, is something we must protect for one another? That is a very critical basis of coming together. Every single faith tradition speaks of nature, because nature is what we are. We would not exist without our environment in every sense of the word. So therefore, one of the key principles has to be that, yes, we come together as people of faith out of love for one another. And that love for one another that transcends the barrier of what we define ourselves as a religion. What is my religion? Whether I'm a Muslim or a Christian or a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Baha'i or a Jew should not matter. I will love nevertheless. I will love regardless. But in order to love regardless, I also have to love my environment and be dedicated to it, to supporting, to sustaining, to protecting. Harmony between religions is about loving one another regardless of the difference, but loving one another in action and showing how we can love one another by protecting, sustaining, and nurturing every single thing around us in our environment. That is faith in action. That is us being beholden to what it takes. When religions come together, when religious leaders, religious institutions, religious communities come together, we find we have plenty of differences between and amongst us. Of course, God created us diverse because he has a higher purpose. It would have been very easy, I would think, for the divine to create us all alike. That shouldn't have been too much of a problem for the divine. But if the divine created us different, including in our beliefs, it is precisely because the idea is the intentionality of working together. The divine created us different in order to be able to nurture one another, to love one another, to believe in what we believe in one another. Our faith systems become an element, a tool, become how we see and understand not only ourselves, but the other. If I respect how you see yourself and your faith system, I am respecting how I see myself and my faith system and my belief. Our problems come when we dissect, when we think in terms of good, bad, pretty, ugly. The truth of the matter is that we are all human beings, exactly as advocated by Baha'u'llah and the Baha'i faith that systematically maintains that we are one, but we have to live as one. And in order to live as one, we have to love in spite of the differences. We have to love the differences. And that means we also have to protect and nurture an environment around us, which might challenge us to live in ways other than the way we've taken for granted so far. And we have taken plenty much for granted. Harmony between religions is not a principle. Harmony between religions equals the survival of the planet and the species on the planet, including human beings. Our task, our mandate as people of faith, whatever the faith, that is being called upon and highlighted in all faith traditions, especially, and you can read it in this tablet, our task and our mandate is to live and love in spite of the differences. That is how we enact the harmony of religions. Our task as humanity is to protect our environment because we love one another, not because we want to live better, but to protect this environment, an obligation that we have to the environment, because that is our obligation to the divine, and because we love one another. That should be the harmony between religions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Karam, for sharing such beautiful and insightful reflections, and especially from your heart. We could all feel it. And I think what you've said has really touched and moved all of us. It is, before we move on, just a reminder that if you have any questions, I see some questions coming in. You can, if you have any questions for any of the speakers, if you could please use the chat function if you're on Zoom, or if you're watching on the live stream on Facebook, if you could write in the comment section. Thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to our third panelist today, Mr. Willie Misak. He was presented with the Queen's Young Leaders Award in 2015 for his work to create a sustainable water supply in his community in Vanuatu. He is the coordinator of the Vanuatu humanitarian team and is committed to improving coordination to more effectively support humanitarian response in Vanuatu. He will be focusing on the principle of the harmony between science and religion, particularly with respect to our shared environmental challenges, and also how we can all benefit from human diversity. He is joining us today from Vanuatu, where I believe it's already about midnight or past midnight there. Welcome, Mr. Misak.
Hi, May, and hello, everyone. First of all, thank you very much for this great honor and opportunity to participate on this very historical event. Thank you also from the Baha'is from Netherlands for that opportunity to give me this chance to speak and share the opinion, my view on science and religion, and also the view of how the Pacific young people, and as well in the Pacific, are working towards peace. The solution to social challenges is unity among all the people, and this is true according to the Baha'is teachings. And also, if we're looking at environmental or economical challenges, it is not a scientific challenge, nor spiritual as alone. Those challenges must be solved in harmony between science and religion. From the tablet of Abdu'l-Bahá, I quote, "Religion must be in conformity with science and reason, so that it may influence the hearts of men. The foundation must be solid and not consider of enmity." From that writing from quoted from the tablet, I would really like to share from the Pacific, especially in Vanuatu, this harmonization that we have, and also the challenges that can bring us to the divisions among science and religion. In the Pacific, as in all the other regions, we have religious beliefs that are cultural beliefs. And the scientific knowledge that come into the region brings another perspective of seeing scientific way of working, and as well as explaining complexity in terms of environmental issues, and as well as addressing some of those environmental issues. However, those beliefs still have that the community are still continuing to hang on those beliefs as the religious belief, to looking at all the natural the natures and the challenges to be tackled in the way that they are addressing in their cultural way of living. And this may become another challenge. At this present day, for example, the COVID-19 gave us this opportunity as well to see that religions and science must really work together. Science alone cannot find the solutions, and it became clear with the COVID-19 that we need spiritual perspective as well to make sure that we can thrive, we can work together to find the solutions towards the COVID-19. And it is same thing that we can find in all the environmental issues that we are facing at the moment. Climate change, the Pacific Islands have going through those challenges on climate change, and the solution is not scientifically, it's not a scientific solution. It must be also a religious solution as well. And this way of working that we have to build will allow will allow humanity to work in different, to allow humanity to work together despite all the differences that they have, where we really brings us into this concept of human diversity. So working in this human diversity is also a challenging thing that we have to make sure that we are ready to accept people with different races and different people with different way of thinking, beliefs, and religion. From that, in the tablet to the Hague, Abdu'l-Bahá Code, should anyone object that since the communities and nations and races and peoples of the world have different formalities, customs, tastes, resentments, morals, varied thoughts, minds, and opinions, it is therefore impossible for ideal unity to be made manifest and complete union among men to be realized. We say that differences are the two kinds. One leads to destruction, and that is like the difference between warring peoples and competing nations who destroy one another, uproot each other's families, do away with rest and comfort, and engage in bloodshed and rapacity. This is blameworthy, but in the other difference consists in variation. This is perfection itself and the cause of the appearance of divine beauty. Consider the flowers of rose garden. The differences is manners, in customs, in appearance, in thoughts, opinions, and temperaments is the cause of the adornment of the world of mankind. If humanity are not taking seriously the way they're looking at human diversity, it will lead into the differences and also lead into disunity among the people. And this is where we as human being have to build also in regards to the oneness of humanity. If we put the differences aside and work together for the betterment of our communities and for humanity, this will give wings to achieve peace and harmony in the world. Whereas the oneness of the world of humanity is very important and is also a foundation to achieve peace. So if we looking at in our own traditions, our own cultures, there's peace, love, and harmony in there, which is very much linked to the spiritual perspectives, and as well as linked to the spiritual principles of religions. No matter what religions, they're all looking at the spiritual perspective and also cultivate the humanity of the spiritual qualities. So which shows that we need to work together and make sure that science and religions are working together for the advancement of civilizations of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Misak. Thank you for your significant contribution. Our next panelist is Dr. Augusto Lopez Claros. He is an international economist and was most recently the Director of Global Indicators and Analysis with the World Bank. He was previously the Chief Economist and Director of the Global Competitiveness Program with the World Economic Forum and the Resident Representative for the International Monetary Fund in the Russian Federation. Dr. Lopez Claros will be focusing on the principle of the elimination of extremes in wealth and poverty and on creating a just and fair economy. He is joining us now from Washington, D.C. Welcome, Dr. Lopez Claros.
Thank you very much, May. It's really a pleasure to be with you today. I'm really very honored to have been invited to participate in this commemoration. One of the early points made by Abdu'l-Bahá in the tablet is to suggest that efforts for peace must be supplemented by other measures that go beyond questions of peace and security. And one of the areas that he focuses on has to do with the nature of the economy and its supporting institutions. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to address three aspects that he touches upon in his tablet under the headlines or themes of fairness, openness, and efficiency. And let me say a few words on each of these points. As some of you may know, Abdu'l-Bahá, a few years before he wrote this tablet, had undertaken an extensive journey through the West, visiting many countries in Europe and spending over 9 months in North America, in Canada and the United States. In a series of talks that he gave in Cleveland, in Jersey City, in Philadelphia and New York, in the period between May and July of 1912, he made multiple references to the economy, and I'd like to sort of touch upon some of these because they feed into years later in some of the thoughts that he presented on the nature of the economy in the tablet to The Hague. In one of the talks in the summer of 1912, he said that references to the New Jerusalem that appear a number of times in the Bible meant, and I quote, a readjustment of the economic order that would come about, meaning specifically the elimination of poverty and a narrowing of income differentials. He said that a readjustment of the social economy is of the greatest importance as it ensures the stability of the world. And he goes on to suggest that without addressing the issue of inequality, what he called the extremes of wealth and poverty, that it would be very, very difficult to actually achieve anything else of value to society. And it seems to me that this warning is really quite timely in the present. 100 years later, in the middle of a global pandemic that has led to extremely high levels of unemployment and that has really undermined the progress that we had made in recent years and decades in reducing extreme poverty. Abdu'l-Bahá did not limit himself to just making a diagnosis and saying that we have a serious problem of inequality in the world, which needs to be addressed. But he actually had a number of very specific, very concrete, very practical suggestions to deal with the problem of inequality. For instance, he came strongly in favor of the introduction of progressive systems of taxation. He doesn't actually use the word progressive in his presentations, but when he gives some of the examples of what he actually means by this, it is evident to an economist that he's actually talking about a system of taxation where as the income rises, the tax rate rises. He spoke about profit sharing as a way of reconciling the interests of the owners and the workers. And in his calls, made a number of times in that summer of 1912, he calls for the elimination of extreme poverty. And in this, one can actually see or recognize in today's contemporary debate, the need for the establishment of some kind of basic income scheme. One of the more sort of eye-opening passages in the tablet to The Hague is his discussion of coercion versus voluntary giving. And referring in particular to the latter, he says that it is a superior form of equity based on the idea that man should not prefer himself to others, but rather should sacrifice his property and life for others and spend willingly for the poor. This is really, it seems to me, a very revolutionary concept. Most of us think that people give through the tax system because they are coerced in doing so, because there are heavy penalties if one does not abide by the existing tax legislation. And yet he's suggesting that perhaps in the future we will develop a new concept of solidarity, whereby people will be willing to share and to give, because this, he suggests, is very much linked to the purpose of life and to who we are. A second concept that he touches upon is the whole question of openness. Abdu'l-Bahá called for an economy that provided a strong safety net for the poor, but also he was an advocate of removing barriers to the international flow of goods and services. In a tablet that he wrote in 1906 to a lady by the name of Jane Elizabeth White, who was the wife of a Scottish minister and who was a fervent admirer of the teachings of Baha'u'llah, he contrasted ancient times in which he said the concept of the unity of mankind did not make sense because of barriers of geography and communication with the 20th century. He, in reference to this period when, in the 1910s and 1920s, he said, in this day, however, means of communication have multiplied and all the members of the human family have become increasingly interdependent. The bonds of trade and industry, of agriculture and education are being strengthened every day. Hence, the unity of mankind can in this day be achieved, he said. Abdu'l-Bahá did not actually use the word globalization, but it is evident that he anticipated the emergence of an interdependent community of nations, reflecting rapid advances in science and technology, just as we saw happen in the rest of the 20th century. And furthermore, in that very interesting document to Jane Elizabeth White, he speaks of the unity of nations, a unity which he said in this century would be securely established, causing all the peoples of the world to regard themselves as citizens of one common fatherland. I think this quote resonates very strongly with the words of Professor Karam when she spoke about the need for coming together as one human family. But in the tablet of The Hague, while he argues, for bringing down barriers that facilitate trade and interaction between nations and peoples, he suggests that this idea of openness has implications as well for politics and for security. He says in the tablet, God has set up no frontier between France and Germany. Boundaries are human creation, which have led to intense enmity, bloodshed, and rapacity. And then he warns, and his warning, it seems to be so pertinent in 1919 and 1920, when he says, if this conception of patriotism remains, it will be the primary cause of the world's destruction. And of course, as you well know, exactly 20 years later, in September of 1939, we launched upon a global conflict, as a result of which we had 60 million fatalities. And it was a conflict that was essentially driven by the kind of patriotism and limited notions of identity that he so heavily criticized in the tablet. Let me move on to the third idea that sort of is highlighted in the tablet, which I would call efficiency. Abdu'l-Bahá in the tablet refers to the proliferation of sophisticated weapons and calls them the malignant fruits of material civilization. I quote, he says, had material civilization been combined with divine civilization, these fiery weapons would never have been invented. Nay, rather, human energy would have been wholly devoted to useful inventions and would have been concentrated on praiseworthy discoveries. This issue of the misuse of resources and human talent is very much part of the discourse around the subject of the new economy. It's present in multiple statements made by Abdu'l-Bahá. And actually, going back to the 19th century, it was very much a theme in the writings and in the messages sent by his father, the founder of the Baha'i faith. In a meeting in 1890 between Baha'u'llah, the founder of the faith, and Edward Brown, who was a Cambridge University Orientalist and professor, Baha'u'llah lamented the misuse of public resources. He said the following, he told Edward Brown, however, we see your kings and rulers spending their treasures more in means for the destruction of the human race than in that which would compare happiness to humanity. And of course, this raises the question of what would be conducive to the happiness of humanity. What is that which would be a better use of the resources rather than allocating them to weaponry and to these malignant fruits of civilization? Well, in other places, Abdu'l-Bahá talks about education, about building human capital, about skills, about providing adequate resources for science and technology, about pushing the boundaries of education, to the outer limit. One final idea in the 1 minute that I have left, which is very much part of the Tablet of the Hague in the second half, is the idea of establishing some form of parliamentary assembly. He's discussing in the tablet the requirements of peace, and therefore inevitably he comes into what we would characterize as, the supporting institutions that should be developed, to ensure peace and security in the future. And he puts forward this idea of setting up a parliamentary assembly. The founders of the League of Nations, which was established around that time, thought of creating such a body as an adjunct to the politicians and to the diplomats who sit on the League's council, as a way of enhancing the democratic legitimacy of this body. The idea did not prosper in respect to the League of Nations, but was revitalized in the 1940s when the elements of the United Nations Charter were being formulated. But it did not happen. Abdu'l-Bahá advocated a tribunal made up of members of national parliaments, their numbers set in proportion to the members' population. And this wouldn't be simply a debating chamber. No, he actually thought that this parliamentary assembly, having the right democratic legitimacy in the way that it would be chosen, would then have the capacity to pass international law in certain areas that would be binding on its members. And in particular, it would be a way to strengthen the collective security mechanisms implicit in the League of Nations covenant, which obviously were never realized. This idea of a parliamentary assembly, ironically, is very much alive today. In 2020, we are commemorating the 20th anniversary, the 75th anniversary of the UN Charter. And there is a very active debate on the need for such an assembly as a way to strengthen the democratic legitimacy of the United Nations, how it will be set up and so on. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lopez Claros, for your thought-provoking presentation. We have now heard from all our panelists, and we are grateful to each of them for sharing their insights. Thank you. You have inspired us and given us much food for thought. Soon, we'll be looking at some of the questions from the participants. I see many questions are coming in. If anyone still has a question, there is time, so please use the chat function if you're on Zoom, or the comment section if you're joining us on the Facebook live stream. So today we've had the opportunity to explore together some of the spiritual principles that are required to support enduring peace. In addition to these principles, Abdu'l-Bahá in the Tablet to the Hague also refers to other principles, such as the promotion of universal education, adopting a universal language, and the independent investigation of reality. What has become clear today from our speakers is that over the past 100 years, we have made some progress as a humanity. There is definitely a clear recognition of humanity's oneness. We have advanced to some extent in our capacity to translate these spiritual principles into action. But what has also been made very clear is that there is still so much work to be done. And indeed, there is an urgency for each of us to play our part, whether as individuals, as communities, as institutions. Our speakers have also illustrated how each of these principles need to work together to establish peace, with the need for justice at the heart of these interrelated spiritual principles. Justice, in fact, allows us to achieve unity. Abdu'l-Bahá also mentions in the tablet the supreme importance of what he calls our shared unity of conscience, which is essential for the foundation of peace to become secure. That is, we must together commit to shared ethical principles and act on them in cooperation. Now we will move on to answering some of the many questions you have asked. The first question, so the way this will work is I'll be asking one of the panelists a question, and then the other panelists will have an opportunity to comment on that question if they wish. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next question. So I see the first question is for Professor Azakaram. Somebody writes, thank you for highlighting the fight for the environment as an area for harmonized religions and faith in action. Could you share one or two best practices where religions show faith in action for the environment? Did you get that, or do you want me to repeat it?
No, I got it. It's nice.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the question. It's a great question. I would point to two specific initiatives that are actually global in scope. One that I'm particularly partial to, because Religions for Peace is also co-leading for many years, is called the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, IRI, the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative. I would just Google it and check it out. It's a remarkable initiative that is bringing together not only the traditional faiths, but also indigenous communities in different countries around the world. 80% of our forests are where 80% of our forests are, and it's an excellent advocacy work to try to protect the lungs of this earth, basically, our very lungs. The other initiative I would point you towards is called Faith for Earth. Again, Faith for Earth, and that is also a global consortium of faith-based organizations. In both cases, the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative and Faith for Earth are UN and faith NGO co-driven, co-led. So they bring together the best of what the UN system upholds. It also brings together the best of what the religious organizations uphold. So Interfaith Rainforest Initiative and Faith for Earth.
Thank you. Do any of our other speakers or panelists wish to comment on this question? All right, then I will continue with the next question. Is for Ms. Bani Dugal. How can we best work together to achieve universal peace? What can every one of us do? Also, perhaps you could mention the 3 very timely seminars recently hosted by the Baha'i International Community on the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, May, and thank you for that good question. Well, I think the attainment of peace is not simply an aspiration to which, you know, we have to be sympathetic, or it's a goal which is complementary to other aims. It should always be a central concern for every individual in the world, for all institutions and, you know, every actor, every stakeholder, because peace is central to the well-being of mankind. As individuals, as Aza had mentioned, we should be working with others, with other community members, with other faith actors in building strong communities. Because once we have strong, resilient communities that are working in harmony and unity together across religions, across classes, we'll have the strong communities that can withstand some of the attacks that come in the form of vested interests by certain groups or political motivations. If we have these strong communities that are working to support the institutions, I think we would be able to build a peaceful world and an ever-advancing civilization. And I think it behooves every single individual. We shouldn't be looking to the other to begin. It's for all of us to be working together across the lines of and the divisions that might exist in our communities. The Baha'i International Community's United Nations office has been working with UN 2020, which is another civil society organization, and Together First. And these initiatives, these organizations have been thinking for the past several years about the future of the United Nations, particularly in this 75th anniversary year. We have Augusto Lopez Claros on the panel. Augusto has written a book on the issue. There are many, many thinkers, great thinkers that are paying a lot of attention to this year and to the future of the UN. And we hosted 3 seminars to examine some of the features of the Elements paper. So the UN governments have put together a paper for which will then be a blueprint for how the governments are going to work together for the future of the UN. And so we had 3 seminars, and these seminars included governments and individuals from civil society and individuals from around the world that are thinking about these issues. And the idea was to acknowledge some of the achievements of the UN, but then to look ahead to strengthening the institution itself. I believe these are online, and if somebody would like to listen in and to the seminars, you can still do so.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. Dugal. Perhaps does Dr. Lopez Claros wish to comment also on this question?
Yes, thank you very much, May. You know, I think it's useful to look a little bit at the historical context. The 75th anniversary of the UN Charter, I think, provides us an opportunity to look back at 1945. And as you well know, that was when, coming out of World War II, the international community, in what I think was a very creative, very innovative initiative, established the United Nations Charter as the founding document of the United Nations, and established a set of principles that were supposed to essentially create a world that would be characterized by peace and security, thereby creating a context for prosperity and human and economic development. Now, one of the problems that we face today, 75 years later, is that the UN Charter has never been modernized. It hasn't been updated. It has remained frozen in time. In 1945, many of the risks that today threaten our future were just not even in the radar screen. The United Nations Charter says nothing on management of the global commons. Climate change had already been identified by scientists as an impending problem, but it was seen as something for the far future. And so I think that in thinking about the United Nations in the next, let's not say century, but the next 25 years, we need to give some serious thought about updating the UN Charter, thinking what are the needs of the world today in light of the changes that have taken place over the last several decades. We are facing a completely new reality, a set of global problems which cannot be solved without strengthening significantly the mechanisms of cooperation, which at the moment are just not delivering solutions to these global problems. Ironically, the UN Charter itself contains the elements of the steps forward. There is an article in the UN Charter that actually calls for a review conference within 10 years of the adoption of the UN Charter. By 1955, we were already supposed to have entered into a debate as to whether the UN Charter was still a document that was appropriate to regulate the aspects of international cooperation on a global scale. That review conference has never taken place because by 1955, we were in the middle of the Cold War, and we enter into a period of many decades of arms buildup and so on. So it seems to me that as we move forward, we need to refocus our attention on the adequacy of this founding document and what we need to do to it to strengthen and empower the United Nations, to actually deliver on the promises that are contained in the Charter, especially in light of the global catastrophic risks that we face that are threatening our future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez Claros. Do any of the other panelists wish to share something? Okay. Then we'll move on to the third question is for Mr. Willy Misak. It says, thank you, Mr. Misak. What do you see as the most immediate challenges in your part of the world, Pacific Islands, Vanuatu, in creating a constructive discourse on the theme of unity of religions? And how do you think what overall principles may be relevant for promoting the harmony of religion and science there? So what are the most immediate challenges concerning that in your part of the world? Thank you, Mr. Misak.
Oh, thank you very much for the question. I think for the Pacific, one of the immediate challenge that we can see in the Pacific is the geographical barriers that we have. Even though within island nations, we still have that geographical barriers that we have, which makes that we are isolated, and some of the remote islands and communities in the Pacific also have lacked to some communications or even in education. So this is geographically, and the other one that goes with the geographical barrier is the educational barriers. Although we have in the SDG the education is universal for all, and also according to the principles of the Baha'i faith about universal educations for all, is still a barriers as well in the Pacific because of the geographical location that of the islands and also the isolations among them. So this is some sort of immediate a challenge that we can see in promoting harmony between science and religion, where education is one of the paramount things that we have to develop to make sure that the communities have access to an education and develop the understanding. And the other challenge that we can see is in the Pacific, we have a very strong culture where women are not very much talking in spaces. Only men can talk in some of the spaces, and women has a specific way of working, and this is part of the culture, and that cultural belief and that cultural way of living is also another barrier towards harmonization of promoting religion and harmony between science and religion as well. So as for to move to promote harmonization between science and religion in the Pacific, some of the principles that we have to consider. One is the equality of men and women that will allow men and women start discussing, because of that culture that we have, women are hardly talking into the spaces in the Pacific. Although some of the scientific women in the Pacific can have this challenge on talking in the same spaces where the people in the Pacific are considered spaces for men. So this is one of the things that I can see, that the principle of equality of men and women will be one of the principles that will allow that the way of taking through science and religion as well. And the other one is the principle of consultation. We find that in the Pacific, we have the challenge between science and the way people come and the scientists came and do the research, and respecting some of the cultural belief that is regarding as a religion, the religious belief in the Pacific as well. And that consultation must allow the space where both scientific and also religion can sit and discuss and share the common view of on particular issues like social or economic issues as well. So I think those are some of the things that I see as common barriers in the Pacific, and as well as some of the principles that can be practically put in place to allow the harmonization of science and religion in the Pacific and in Vanuatu.
Thank you, Mr. Misak. Thank you for sharing your experience with us. And thank you for being with us. It must be about 1 o'clock or something for you in the morning. I see that the next question is for Dr. Augusto Lopez Claros, and I see there's an A, B, and C for you. So hopefully we'll see how we go through them. Question for A is, Abdu'l-Bahá spoke that the supreme need of humanity is cooperation and reciprocity. Our current economic system instead is founded on competition. How do you think we can move from competitive to cooperative economies and thus contribute to peace? Now I'll read all the others and maybe you can put them all together as one. Otherwise you'll just do one and we'll come back to the others later. The second one is, because you're working with the World Bank, it says the World Bank does not always have a good reputation in terms of exploitation of developing nations to their detriment. How can this be changed? And the third question to you is, thank you so much. Could you elaborate on the aspect of efficiency? Which measures would assist humanity to focus their talents and resources on material and spiritual progress? So though there's 3 different questions, maybe you're able to put it all together. If not, if you like, I can go back to the first one.
Thank you. All of them are very good questions. And let me take them in reverse order.
Okay.
On the issue of efficiency, you know, I started that question by referring to the conversation between the founder of the Baha'i faith and Edward Brown, in which Baha'u'llah lamented the waste of resources and human talent. And in fact, this message is taken again by Abdu'l-Bahá in the Tablet of the Hague, you know, where he talks about how if we had balanced the progress that we had made on the material side, you know, with ethical and moral principles, which he calls divine civilization, these malignant weapons would never have been invented, and we would have allocated those resources, you know, to more useful inventions, he says, which would be of greater benefit to mankind. So this is a debate that, you know, that has taken place among economists, you know, throughout the ages. The IMF, for instance, refers to something that they call unproductive expenditures. These are elements in the budgets of most countries that basically do not deliver improvements in productivity, do not necessarily deliver improvements in human capacity and in skills. And the primary item that falls under this area of unproductive expenditures is actually the military defense spending. We allocate annually vast resources to propping up our military establishments because we don't have a system of collective security, something that Abdu'l-Bahá calls for in the Tablet of the Hague. It isn't just that we want to have a system of collective security to ensure peace and security in the world, but fundamentally we want to do so that we can redirect those resources to things that are actually more constructive of human welfare. Things like education, like public health, like you know, infrastructure. Why is it that the pandemic today, you know, has caused such havoc in the world? Partly is because our health systems, we're discovering, are woefully unprepared to meet a calamity of this nature. And therefore, going forward, maybe we should rethink the priorities of public spending. Maybe we're spending too much subsidizing energy and accelerating climate change, and we're not spending enough on boosting the quality of our health system so that when the next pandemic comes, you know, we will be better prepared and we will mitigate some of the damage. So I find it very encouraging that the Abdu'l-Bahá and earlier on his father, you know, got themselves into this debate about priorities in the allocation of resources and in the allocation of talent to things that we do. On the question of, you know, the World Bank and other multilateral organizations sometimes being criticized, look, this applies as well to the United Nations. The United Nations has been the subject of heavy criticism throughout the decades, especially for its failures to deliver peace and security in Rwanda, in Cambodia, in Sudan, in Darfur, and in multiple other places. But what I want to remind the audience is that these organizations are essentially cooperative organizations. They are made up of shareholders. the limitations of the United Nations are essentially a result of the design of the members when the organization was set up. Would we like the United Nations or the multilateral development banks to do more? Then maybe we should empower them to do more. Maybe we should give them the jurisdiction to act in areas where at the moment they are not able to act. Maybe we should give them additional resources. The United Nations budget is pitifully small in relation to the needs of the world in today's interdependent community. The United Nations budget is not only small in relation to these needs, but is also subject to a whole range of constraints of an administrative nature that make it very difficult for the United Nations to plan things in a kind of a longer term perspective. So these organizations, it is my view, will become more important in the future. We are realizing their critical importance in the context of a world that is facing problems, all of which are global in nature, none of which can be resolved simply by nations acting on their own through mechanisms of national sovereignty. All of them require cooperation. All of them require us coming together, as Professor Karam so eloquently put it in her presentation. On the issue of cooperation and competition, some aspects of competition are all not bad. Economists, for instance, like to have some degree of competition in the delivery of services because this improves, this lowers prices and makes life easier for consumers. In countries where there is only one provider of, let's say, internet or mobile telephone services, I assure you, consumers pay very high prices. In larger markets where there is room for several providers, through the forces of competition, the consumers benefit themselves and they face lower prices. So not every aspect of competition is something that we should abhor and that we should reject. However, the concept of cooperation, yes, of course, in addressing the issue of income inequality, all of the proposals that are currently on the table as to how to do this effectively involve nations coming together and cooperating in some way. For instance, by improving the efficiency of the tax system so that we don't have tax havens, so that we don't have situations where corporations have incentives to move to locations where they will face a lower tax rate. And to address this problem, which leads to huge leakages of revenue to government budgets, we need nations coming together and essentially eliminating these leakages in a collaborative way. There is already a huge amount of cooperation taking place, of course, in the scientific arena. This is perhaps the area where it works most effectively, through the sharing of information, through the publication of results, through the sharing of data, and so on. So we have made a great deal of progress. Can we do more in terms of cooperation? Yes, of course we can. And for me, perhaps the highest priority in this area is to strengthen the framework of multilateral institutions which were created in 1945 and which at the moment are under great stress because of lack of funding, because of lack of jurisdiction, or because in some cases, they just simply don't know what to do because we face a very complex set of global problems. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You did a fantastic job in answering all three of those questions. Thank you. I see that we have still a little bit of time for some questions. The next question is actually, these questions seem to be for all the panelists. The question is, what does it look like for each of us to do our part? I can imagine that many of us are watching and many of us are as individuals. Some people, of course, are serving on institutions or in part of communities. So this question, what does it look like for each of us to do our part? As we all heard that there needs to be some action, and I think everybody I can see the questions coming in that people are eager to understand what they can do. So perhaps we can first start with Ms. Dougal. Could we start with you perhaps? And then everybody could mention something about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, I think for each of us to do our part is to look and see where there's need in our communities around us and to step up and contribute. There's a lot to be done. And I think every single individual has a role to play in advancing societies towards a place of peace. And I find that increasingly we are seeing an adversarial approach, which seems to be becoming the norm in our societies, whether it's from politics to economics with the competition to even in our social structures, we find that people feel that they have to take on an adversarial approach. And I think that is a problem and actually serves to only weaken society. But so perhaps all of us should be doing our part to work collaboratively with one another in order to advance development in our societies, but to build harmonious communities. And this is very possible to do. At this time, I have neighbors who are, they just have a sewing machine and they're making masks. There are others who are taking little food packets and giving them out. I mean, it's small actions like that. Whatever little every individual can do is going to contribute to a better world, a more united world, and a peaceful world. So.
Thank you, Ms. Dougal. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask Professor Karam, would you be able to comment on that question?
Sure. Thank you for the question. There's not much to add to what I think Bani has captured beautifully, but I would say that there are two things that we could do. One is to never be complacent, never assume that the vote doesn't matter, that things are going to be decided anyway, my voice doesn't count. Never be complacent about the rights that each of you have. Every single right is a treasure and has to be actively exercised and fought for, struggled for, if it isn't there, together. So the lack of complacency, I would think, is a criteria of definitely we have to do. The other thing I would say is what I was trying to say earlier, which is we should never take for granted the fact that working together is hard work, but we have to be actively working together across our differences. It's actually easy. It's important. It's very important to do the work within our own communities. Absolutely important. It is even more important, however, and much more difficult to work across our myriad differences, ethnic, racial, gender, national, religious. That is hard work. It takes a lot of hard work to do that, but that's exactly what we have to do. We have to work across our differences. We can gauge the value of our work every day by how many barriers have I transcended today in my outreach towards others. Yes, we gauge it also by what have I done for someone else today? In one day, what have I done for someone else that wasn't about me and for me? The next question I think we have to ask is, what have I done together with those whom I would normally not have reached out to or wanted to work with or seen as valuable to work with? I think that challenge to self is always extremely important. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Misak, do you have what is can you share something about this question? About what it is that each of us can do, whether we're an individual, institution, or community, how can we play our part?
What is important is that I can say that education's around us in whatever way that we can do. And if we have a chance to educate people around us, we have to use those opportunities and educate the people around us on how to build peace as well. And I think that we can all do this by doing to our families. The starting point is our families, which is a very close one and easy one to do, and our neighbors as well. So I think if we are, and for us and countries that have the opportunity, like for example in Vanuatu, we don't have at the moment we don't have any case of COVID-19. Using those opportunity to continuously helping educating communities and grassroots people to understand the importance of working together, and also importance of the spiritual perspective in this time of crisis, and so and the importance of working together beyond those crises to build a better world. So as long as we have the opportunities to educate people around us, take those chances and do it. And I know that we have different challenges as well. For example, in the Pacific, we have this diversity of languages, and even in Vanuatu himself, we have 134 languages, but we have to adapt and making sure that we continuously educating people around us about the importance of working together towards a peace.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Lopez Claros, do you have any remarks about what it looks like for each of us to do our part?
Thank you very much. Yes, just a thought that comes to mind. You know that when you think about what are the 3 or 4 most important initiatives of international cooperation that have taken place in the last 20 years globally, you think of the creation of the International Criminal Court in the early part of the new century. You think of the 2015 Paris Agreement on Climate Change, which, you know, while not a very effective instrument, at least it was a recognition on the part of the vast majority of the world that, you know, we have a serious problem that we need to do something about. You think of, let's say, the 2017 Treaty on the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons, the treaty to ban landmines. These are 4 sort of very important moments in the last 20 years that brought together nations of the world to address a global problem, a global concern. The main characteristic of all those initiatives is that they were started not by governments, but by civil society organizations. All of them were the result of initiatives taken at the place of citizens like you and me and the people participating in this conference. In fact, this has been noted by experts, and they have coined it a new term. They said, we are now living in a world of a new diplomacy. The initiatives are no longer taken by governments because governments have limited jurisdiction, because governments are dealing with the crisis today, because governments have a vested interest in protecting national sovereignty, and their incentives are not always aligned with the needs of an interdependent world. And so my answer to this question is identify that one issue which really you feel passionate about. Is it the environment? Is it gender equality? Is it the concerns that you have about nuclear proliferation? I mean, there are a multiplicity of problems. Unfortunately, there is no shortage of problems, you know, facing humanity. And then essentially make your actions felt through the work of these civil society organizations. The solutions to future problems will come as a result of efforts done at the grassroots level. And I think that is certainly something that the Baha'i community is very much identified with, how to strengthen the power of civil society as a catalyst for change in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The time has come to bring this program to a close, and I'm so sorry we couldn't get to all your questions that you posed, but I feel that what we've heard from the speakers today, we all are quite clear about the different actions that we can take as individuals or members of communities or part of institutions. But you are able to continue to write your questions and your comments, if you like, in the chat box on Zoom or on the comments on the Facebook page, because we will be gathering all of these together and we can share it with our panelists. So we will leave the chat boxes open for you to be able to write any comments that you have or questions still, and we can share it with them. I'd like to thank all of our speakers for your amazing contribution. It has been a rich and inspiring gathering. And also I'd like to thank all of you, the participants who've joined us today from all parts of the world and from different time zones for this historic commemoration. It has been a pleasure to be with you today. We will end this commemoration with some more inspiring music from Luc Slot. Thank you, Luc.
Create in me a pure heart, oh my God, oh my God, and renew a tranquil conscience within me, oh my home, through the Spirit of power, confirm thou me in thy cause. Oh, my best beloved, confirm thou me in thy cause, and by the light of thy glory reveal unto me thy path. By the light of thy glory reveal unto me thy path. O thou, the goal of my desire, and through the power of thy transcendent might, lift me up unto the heaven of thy holiness, O source of my being, and by the breezes of thine eternity, gladden me, O thou who art my God. Let thine everlasting melodies breathe tranquility bring me joy. Oh, thou art the most manifest of the manifest, and the most hidden of the hidden, the most manifest of the manifest, and the most hidden of the hidden, of the hidden, of the hidden, of the hidden, of the hidden.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you for taking us into a whole other realm. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. I do hope that we will all be able to bring forward Abdu'l-Bahá's vision for peace that is so beautifully expressed in the tablet to the Hague. Thank you and goodbye.